Just over 2 months from today, on October 1st, 2026, one of the biggest cost shifts in decades quietly hits the entire UK property market. And almost nobody buying a flat right now has any idea it's coming. It's called the Building Safety Levy. It's a tax, plain and simple, and from that date onward, it gets added to nearly every single new home built in England. Not retroactively, not on old buildings. On the next flat you might buy, or the one your son or daughter is saving up for right now. The government expects it to raise £3.4 billion from new residential developments over the coming years, and the industry's own trade body has already put a number on what that means per property. Roughly £3,000 added to the cost of every new plot on average. In some parts of the country, considerably more. And here's the thing, nobody's telling buyers. That number was calculated before the rush we're about to walk you through even started. Here's the piece almost nobody outside the construction and planning world has actually read. It's called the Building Safety Levy Regulations 2025, and it was quietly laid before Parliament back in November of last year. It's dense, it's technical, and it never made the evening news. No press conference, no headline, just a document sitting on a government website while the clock underneath it kept running. But right now, it's rewriting how much it costs to bring a new flat to market in England, and who ends up paying for it. So let's actually walk through this together, because three things are happening at once here, and each one matters if you're anywhere near the UK property market this year. First, we're going to break down exactly what this levy is and why it exists, because the origin story matters more than you'd think, and it's not the story you might expect. Second, there's a number buried in the industry press right now that shows developers are already racing the clock to beat this deadline, and what that rush is doing to the very safety standards this law was built to protect. And third, we're going to get practical about what this actually means if you're trying to buy a new build flat this year, or if you're a smaller developer wondering whether you're about to get squeezed out of the market entirely. Let's start with why this exists, because it didn't come from nowhere. This is a direct descendant of the Grenfell Tower fire and the years of fallout that followed. You've probably already heard from earlier videos on this channel just how deep the cladding crisis runs in this country. The buildings still not remediated, the leaseholders still trapped, the bill that's ballooned into the tens of billions. For years, the government's position was clear in principle and messy in practice. The people who built these buildings unsafely should pay to fix them, not the leaseholders living in them, and not the taxpayer. In practice, getting developers to actually pay has been a slow, painful fight, with pledges, voluntary schemes, and a patchwork of funding that's left thousands of buildings still waiting, still unsellable, still trapping the people inside them in a limbo that's now stretched past most people's patience. The Building Safety Levy is the government's attempt to close that gap permanently by making the payment mandatory rather than voluntary. From October 1st, most new residential developments in England defined as 10 or more dwellings, or 30 or more bed spaces if it's student accommodation, will be charged a fee as part of the building control process. That fee is calculated using the gross internal area of the development, and the rate varies depending on which local authority you're building in, with higher rates attached to areas with higher land values. Developments built on previously used brownfield land get a 50% discount as an incentive to build there rather than eating into greenfield sites. Certain developments are carved out entirely, small sites under 10 homes, social housing, and buildings with a clear community benefit like care homes or school accommodation. And the enforcement mechanism has real teeth. Payment has to be made to the local authority before the final building control completion certificate is issued, which means a developer literally cannot legally finish and hand over a building without paying it. Scotland, by comparison, has pushed its own version of this levy back to 2028, which tells you something about how disruptive even the government's own advisors expect this to be. And this isn't even the first time developers have been asked to pay. Through self-remediation commitments and a separate charge called the Residential Property Developer Tax, the country's biggest house builders have already put roughly £6 billion toward fixing existing unsafe buildings before this levy even starts. But that money came from a relatively small pool of large established companies who signed voluntary pledges. This levy widens the net to catch almost everyone building new homes, regardless of whether their company was anywhere near the buildings that caused this crisis in the first place. Two very different groups end up paying into the same pot, and only one of them had any hand in creating the problem. That's the mechanism, and on paper, it's exactly what campaigners have wanted for years. Developers pay, not leaseholders. But here's where it gets complicated, and where the real story of this video actually begins. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down exactly what's happening in UK property law and what it means for the people actually living through it, not the sanitized version you get in a press release. And this is one of the bigger shifts we've covered all year. Now here's the part that should genuinely worry you, whether you're a buyer, a small developer, or just someone trying to make sense of where new build prices are heading. Because the closer October 1st gets, the more evidence there is that this deadline isn't just changing costs, it's changing behavior in a way that runs directly against the spirit of the law itself. Legal advisors across the property sector have been telling developers for months to look at their pipeline and ask a blunt question. Can we get our building control applications submitted before October 1st? Because the rule is precise, almost surgically so. If your application goes in before that date, you're exempt from the levy, potentially for years, even if construction finishes well after. If it goes in on or after that date, you're charged, full stop, no exceptions, no grace period. One legal analysis actually did the maths on what that's worth to a real project. A 50-unit scheme in Westminster would save roughly £392,000 simply by filing before October instead of after. Sit with that figure for a second because it's worth letting it actually land. Nearly £400,000 on one single scheme, riding on nothing more than which side of a calendar date the paperwork happens to fall on. That's not a rounding error. That's the kind of number that changes how fast a company moves and how many corners it's tempted to cut to get there. And they are moving fast. Industry analysts are describing what they expect in the coming weeks as a genuine rush. Developers pushing to get applications filed, submitted, and locked in before the window closes. On its own, that might just sound like sensible business planning, the kind any of us would do if a few £100,000 were on the table. But listen to what the advisors are actually warning developers about, because it's telling. One firm's guidance to clients was blunt. If your application isn't genuinely ready, don't submit incomplete work just to beat the deadline. Building safety specialists have separately warned that developers rushing toward the cutoff, especially those going through the more complex approval process required for higher-risk buildings, risk having applications rejected, which then forces a resubmission after the deadline has passed, meaning they pay the levy anyway, on top of the delay, on top of the legal costs already spent trying to dodge it. Sit with that for a second. This is a law that exists because a building was allowed to deteriorate for years while the people in charge of it decided fixing it wasn't worth the cost and the inconvenience. And the mechanism designed to stop that from happening again is currently creating a financial incentive to move faster through the approval gates right now, in the weeks before this video goes out. That's not a conspiracy theory, and it's not us reading between the lines. That's the plain, published advice law firms are giving their developer clients this summer in writing on their own websites. Now let's talk honestly about who actually gets hurt by this, because it isn't evenly spread out, and the data on that is already public. When the government first proposed this levy, there was a planned exemption for medium-sized developments, sites of between 10 and 50 homes, specifically designed to protect smaller house builders from being crushed by a tax built with volume house builders in mind. That exemption was removed in the final regulations, gone in the final draft, without the fanfare that came with announcing the levy in the first place. The National Federation of Builders called the decision, in their own words, an appalling way to treat the businesses that didn't cause the problems this levy is meant to fix. That's not a throwaway line. That's a trade body representing thousands of small builders telling the government, on the record, that the people being asked to pay the biggest relative price had nothing to do with the crisis in the first place. The Home Builders Federation has gone further, warning that in some parts of the country this levy will make development financially unviable altogether, meaning homes that would have been built simply won't be. at a moment when the country is already short of housing supply and every party in government keeps promising to fix that shortage. And here's the layer that ties it back to you, whoever's watching this and thinking about buying a new build flat this year. Every one of these costs, the levy itself, the legal fees to navigate it, the risk premium builders are pricing in because of the compliance uncertainty, all of it gets baked into the price of the finished flat. Multiple legal and planning firms tracking this have said plainly that the additional costs to developers are likely to end up as additional costs to buyers. Not might, are likely to. That's not campaigners talking. That's the property lawyers advising the developers themselves in guidance written for the developers, not for you. So picture what October 1st actually looks like from a few different seats. If you're a major house builder with the legal team and the cash flow to fast-track applications before the deadline, you absorb the disruption, and maybe you even benefit from smaller competitors dropping out of the market entirely. If you're a smaller developer without that flexibility, you're now facing a cost that was never supposed to apply to you, on a project where the numbers were already tight before anyone added a new tax to the equation. And if you're a first-time buyer looking at a new build flat that completes anytime from later this year onward, you're likely paying a slice of this levy without ever seeing it itemized anywhere, folded quietly into the asking price, the same way stamp duty, VAT on materials, and every other invisible cost of construction always has been. This is where it connects to something we've talked about before on this channel. Video 8 walked through how Help to Buy pushed a generation of buyers into new build flats at inflated prices, with costs baked in that nobody made visible at the point of sale. This levy risks becoming the next version of that same pattern, a real, well-intentioned policy designed to fix a genuine injustice whose actual cost quietly lands on the next first-time buyer standing in a show home, being told the price on the board is simply the price. Full stop. Take it or leave it. We're not going to pretend we can put a precise figure on what this does to your individual mortgage affordability, because it depends entirely on where you're buying, what the local authority's rate turns out to be, and how much of the cost a developer decides to pass through versus absorb. But here's the honest, unglamorous truth of it. The part that doesn't make for a dramatic headline but matters more than almost anything else in this video. Added costs on new build developments almost never stay with the developer. They move downstream to the buyer because that's who the price is ultimately set for every single time. Think about what that actually does to someone scraping together a deposit right now. In a market where a 5 or 10% deposit is already the single hardest wall between a renter and a homeowner, another few £1,000s folded into the asking price isn't a footnote. It's months of saving. It's the difference between qualifying for a mortgage and falling just short of it. It's a first-time buyer doing everything right, budgeting carefully, saving every spare pound, and still watching the target quietly move further away because of a policy decision made in a parliamentary committee room they never heard about. And it's worth zooming out for a moment because this doesn't land in isolation. We've spent this entire year on this channel tracking a housing market that's already under strain from every direction. Flats sitting unsellable because of cladding that still hasn't been fixed. Leaseholders trapped by service charges that keep climbing. Thousands of homes standing empty in London while people are priced out of buying anything at all. Now add a new, mandatory cost to the one part of the market that was supposed to offer an escape route. Brand new homes built to modern standards, marketed as the safe, straightforward option compared to buying into an older building with an uncertain cladding history. That escape route just got more expensive too, and it happened through a regulation almost nobody watching this video has ever heard mentioned on the news. So what do you actually do with this, depending on where you sit? If you're looking at buying a new build flat this year or next, ask directly when the building control application for that development was submitted. If it went in before October 1st, that development is very likely exempt from this levy for the life of that application, which tells you something about how the price was calculated. If it's going in after, or if the development hasn't started construction yet, assume the levy is priced in somewhere, and use that as a genuine point to interrogate the asking price rather than accept it as fixed. If you're weighing a discounted new build flat and trying to work out whether it's a good deal or a trap, apply the same logic that's worked for every crisis we've covered on this channel. A development can be cheaper because the wider market is soft while the underlying project is financially sound. That tends to recover. A development that's cheap because a smaller developer is cutting corners to survive a viability squeeze is a different animal entirely, and it's worth asking your solicitor directly about the developer's financial position before you commit to anything. If you're watching this as a smaller developer or work in the industry, the exemption that used to protect medium-sized schemes is gone. And the anti-avoidance provisions in the regulations mean splitting a development into smaller phases, specifically to dodge the levy, isn't a workaround. The rules were written to catch exactly that. The honest advice echoed by the same legal firms advising developers to move fast is not to rush a genuinely unready application just to beat a deadline. A rejected application after October first costs you the levy anyway, plus the delay, plus a second attempt, plus whatever goodwill you've burned with your lender in the meantime. And if you simply want to track this without acting on it yet, the number to watch is October 1st itself, and specifically what happens to new build asking prices in the weeks immediately after. That's when we'll start to see in real listings whether developers absorb this cost or pass it straight through, and it will tell you a lot about the state of the wider new build market in the months that follow. One more thing worth doing, whichever seat you're sitting in. Local authorities are publishing their individual levy rates as part of this rollout, and those rates aren't uniform. They're higher in areas with higher land values and lower elsewhere. If you already know roughly where you want to buy, it's worth checking whether your local authority's rate has been published yet, because that single figure, multiplied across a development's floor area, is often the clearest early signal of how much of this cost is about to show up in local asking prices. One honest caveat before we close, because it matters, and because this channel doesn't do fear without fairness. This levy is not, on its own, a villain. It exists because leaseholders spent years paying for defects they didn't cause, and the entire point of this policy is to stop that from happening again by making developers, not residents, foot the bill. That's a genuinely good and overdue principle, one that campaigners fought for over the better part of a decade. What we've walked through today isn't an argument against the levy existing. It's a warning about what happens in the gap between a policy's good intention and its real-world rollout. The rush to beat a deadline, the smaller builders squeezed out, the cost that quietly lands on the next buyer anyway, no matter how carefully the law was written to prevent exactly that. Policy on paper and policy in practice are rarely the same thing, and the weeks around October 1st are going to be the clearest evidence yet of which one wins out. So that's why buyers, builders, and everyone watching the UK new build market should be paying attention to this right now, not after the deadline's passed and the decisions are already made. The date is real, it's close, and for a lot of developments already moving through the pipeline, the decisions being made this summer quietly in solicitors' offices and planning departments up and down the country will decide who actually pays for this. We say it often on this channel, but it bears repeating here. The biggest costs in property rarely arrive with a warning label. They arrive in documents like this one, dense, technical, published without ceremony, doing their work in the background while the rest of us are simply trying to find somewhere to live. If this helped you make sense of what's coming, that's exactly what this channel is here for. And I'll see you in the next one.